Welcome to everyone who's writing into us in the chat where you're from all around the world. We welcome you. Thank you for joining us for Tricycle's online practice session today. My name is Danya, and I'm the online learning manager at Tricycle. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Batchelor as our guest today. Stephen is a Buddhist teacher and writer known for his secular or agnostic approach to the Dharma. And formerly a Buddhist monk in the Tibetan and Zen traditions. He is the translator and author of several books, including Buddhism Without Beliefs, Living with the Devil, and After Buddhism. And his most recent book, published this past February, is The Art of Solitude. So today we're on a Zoom webinar, so participant audio and video are off, and we are recording the session for anyone unable to attend with us live. You can view recordings of this session as well as the schedule for upcoming sessions at tricycle.org/live. And you can also make a donation to support these free offerings. I'm hearing that there might be a sound problem. Can most people hear me? Yes, okay. Sorry if you're having an issue with that. If you are having an issue with sound, I do recommend headphones. They help me hear clearly. So today, Stephen would actually like to offer this session as a benefit for Gaia House, a retreat center in Devon, UK, where he has hosted many retreats and Dharma programs over the past 30 years. As many of you know, this is a really challenging time for retreat centers around the world, as many of the programs that they rely on for funding have been canceled due to the pandemic. So if you are able, please consider making a donation to support Gaia House at this time. I'll post their URL for that in the chat. And then finally, at the end of today's session, we will have time for some Q&A with Stephen. So you can post your questions in the Q&A panel, which is through the button below the video screen in Zoom. And if you are on Facebook Live, you can also post a question in the comments there, and we'll add it to the queue and try to get to as many questions as we can. We'll be on for about an hour today, and I think that's it for me. So thank you very much to you, Stephen, for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Danya, and welcome to all of you who are out there somewhere in your own particular variant of lockdown or confinement. This evening I'm going to talk about the practice of solitude. Something that many of us have had, quite a lot of time to be working on, I suspect. I'd like to start with a poem. This is by the British poet Philip Larkin. Uncontradicting solitude supports me on its giant palm, and like a sea anemone or simple snail, there cautiously unfolds, emerges what I am. So we see here that in solitude, when we're on our own, particularly in a sustained, reflective manner, it brings us into an intimacy with ourselves, an intimacy with our own inwardness. As on a meditation retreat, we create the opportunity to no longer be so overwhelmed by all the stuff that's coming in from the media and through our iPhones or whatever we use. And instead we settle down to what it feels like to be me, effectively, what it feels like to be me, what it means to be me. And in this space of solitude, we, in a way, are able to reveal ourselves, certainly to ourselves, but also if you're in lockdown with close family or friends or partners, that there's also a revealing of ourselves that might go deeper in some ways than our everyday chit-chat and conversation. It's very much a time, I think, for us to explore with greater intimacy the very fabric and sense and feel of who we are. And as Daniel mentioned, I recently published a book called The Art of Solitude. And that was a project that took me a number of years to complete. It covers quite a different range of approaches to solitude, including philosophy, meditation, reflection, the practice of art, and so on. But what I think is perhaps the most useful way to approach this topic of practicing solitude is to dwell on a distinction that we find in the Buddha's teaching, as recorded in the early texts, between bodily solitude and spiritual, or we might say mental solitude. Chitta viveka. Viveka means solitude, chitta means heart or soul or mind. Bodily solitude is what we're in a way obliged to practice in the confinement around the corona pandemic. And it's relatively straightforward. In fact, it's extremely straightforward. You just don't go anywhere. You stay put. And this is the same as if you were a hermit going up into a mountain, hiding away in a cave somewhere for some time, or whether you find yourself in your apartment in Brooklyn by yourself for weeks on end. Same experience from a physical point of view, from a bodily point of view. Your body is cut off from other bodies. And it's a very common mistake in certainly in Buddhism, but in other spiritual and contemplative traditions too, to somehow romanticize bodily solitude, to dream about going off to a little hut in the wilderness and spending a month or a year or whatever it might be there, as though that would somehow do the trick. We have all sorts of ideas as to, how we would be able to focus on our meditation practice and read all the books that we've wanted to read for so many years to really get to grips with some of the big questions of life and death. But, as probably many of us have discovered, just to physically isolate yourself might initially, once it's still somehow a novelty, produce some of those effects. We become quite still. We become fascinated perhaps with being in this unfamiliar situation. But as with meditation retreats, after a day or so, your demons catch up with you. All of those worrying, niggling anxieties and concerns and fears and so forth all come rushing back. And we find ourselves physically alone, but no longer really experiencing solitude, aloneness. That's now somehow escaped us, because at this point, we've found that although our bodies are alone, our minds are very crowded, full of thoughts, full of feelings, full of emotions, full of memories, full of plans. And it becomes increasingly difficult to hear the sound of your own voice. There's all kinds of chatter going on. You may have your parents in the background, your partners, your children, your friends, your teachers. They're all there, saying all kinds of stuff. They won't shut up. And your voice, who you are, what you have to say, kind of gets lost in all of the racket. So spiritual solitude or mental solitude is the practice of carving out the solitary space for yourself inside. And that is what the philosopher Michel de Montaigne called true solitude, genuine solitude. being alone in a cave is only a kind of simulacrum, a copy of real solitude. It might serve as a good metaphor, being alone in a cave, but genuine solitude is something you have to work on rather hard. And to commit yourself, to dedicate yourself to cultivating qualities of attention, qualities of collectedness, samadhi, qualities of a heightened self-awareness, qualities of being able to investigate and inquire more deeply into what your experience is bringing up. I also feel that this inner solitude requires a certain degree of courage, because when we're left to our own devices, as they say in the Christian tradition, the devil likes idle hands, or something like that. Once we kind of find ourselves alone, we find that we are very vulnerable in one way to all kinds of difficult and disturbing thoughts and emotions. And it sometimes takes quite some courage and inner strength to stabilize our attention in the midst of all of this. This experience is stated very clearly in the first verse of a Buddhist sutta called the Guha Sutta, the discourse on the cell in the sense of a cave or a closed place. And here we do in fact have, in this sutta, a recognition of precisely what I've been speaking about. I'll read it out to you, the first verse. It's chapter 2 of the Atthakavagga, which is usually translated as the chapter of eights. And these poems that I'm referring to are likewise the framework for my book, The Art of Solitude. But the first verse says this: the creature concealed inside its cell, a man sunk in dark passions, is a long, long way from solitude. In other words, just to hide away in a cave somewhere can simply afford your capacity to indulge your own dark passions, as the text says. And to do so makes you very different, very remote from the actual experience of genuine solitude. So this practice of solitude is in many ways very comparable to what we might otherwise call my contemplative practice, my Dharma practice. But solitude is not just about finding a kind of inner spaciousness and quiet, because once we cultivate this solitude, it becomes closer and closer to the experience of nirvana. And by nirvana, I don't mean some permanent state of enlightenment or liberation or anything like that. But nirvana, as the Buddha described it in the early texts, as the absence of greed, the absence of hatred, and the absence of confusion or opinionatedness. And in that way, we can see that nirvana too is a way of talking about being with ourselves in a way where we're left alone. We're solitary, not left alone by other people and places and so on, but left alone by our own inner demons. And recently, just by chance, I was looking through the Udana, which is another collection of early Buddhist texts. And there I found a passage which said, the Tathagata, the true person, the Buddha, the sage, delights in and enjoys solitude. This thought often occurs to him: I have let go of what is unskillful. So clearly here, solitude has to do with letting go of something, letting go of what crowds us out. We might loosely call this reactivity, the inner chatter, the inner emotions, and so on. But once we begin this process of letting go, of just letting these mental voices just chatter away until they fizzle out of their own accord, then this solitude slowly develops into the experience of nirvana itself. In the practice of the 4 tasks, which is something I've written about at length in my recent books, particularly after Buddhism, I think of Dharma practice as about engaging and embracing with life, which means to accept radically the situation you find yourself in, both externally and internally. To embrace also the reactivity that arises in your mind, but to then learn how to let that be, to not get entangled in it, to the point where you begin more and more to experience moments that allow you to actually experience and witness for yourself what it's like to be non-reactive, to be still, to be clear, and for at least a moment or 2 or 3 or 10 or 15 or 100, to cherish that experience. A book that, or not a book, an essay that was published in 1988 by the Thai Buddhist monk Ajahn Buddhadasa was called Nirvana for Everyone. And Buddhadasa's aim was to take nirvana down off its pedestal and bring it firmly back to planet Earth. He says, nirvana has become a secret that no one cares about, buried away in scriptures, to be paid occasional lip service while no one really knows what it is. So Buddhadasa insists that even the temporary cessation of a reactive emotion is nirvana. When a moment of anger or hatred or fear eventually fades away and dies down, that stopping is a nirvanic moment. And this kind of nirvana is available to everyone, Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike. It's simply where we naturally come to rest between moments of stress and turbulence. It's nothing unfamiliar. It's simply that we don't always acknowledge these moments of quiet, of stillness, as being mini moments of nirvana itself. For Buddhadasa, even animals experience these moments of peace. And without them, life would simply not be possible. If we were constantly driven by our reactivity, we wouldn't really have time to live. We'd be exhausted. But we know from experience that there's an ebb and a flow of these patterns. And the point with practicing solitude is to practice the valorizing, the affirmation of these spaces. And we also find in a very early statement from Gautama, the Buddha himself, that nirvana, he said, is clearly visible, immediate, inviting, uplifting, and personally experienced by the wise, not just by the wise Buddhists, but by the wise. And this passage, which is quite well known, likewise echoes what Buddhadasa is saying, namely that nirvana is here and now. Nirvana is all those moments of stopping, temporary or longer, and that becomes a very central core of one's practice. Nirvana is not something far away, it's right here. So we might also consider that the temporary cessation of what drives the global economy, all the industry and the traffic and the planes and all of this stuff that is strangely all stopped or largely, that we could also see that as a kind of social experience of nirvana. And our lockdown becomes an opportunity to dwell in this space, to cherish that non-reactive awareness that lockdown makes possible. And by coming to rest in that space that is emptied even briefly of attachment and fear and opinions and so on, we begin to glimpse the freedom to respond to ourselves and our lives and the world with care, rather than merely being caught up in our reactive habits. Buddhadasa's work in many ways calls for a secular nirvana, a nirvana, as he puts it, for everyone, which would be a naturalized nirvana, a nirvana that's already part and parcel of the fabric of our existence, and a democratized nirvana, a nirvana that's not just the privilege of particularly spiritually advanced people. And this nirvana is not about the ending of suffering. This kind of non-reactivity is what allows the beginning of human flourishing. So in exposing us to the threat of death, while granting us free time to contemplate what human life is for, this coronavirus pandemic may inspire a more heartful commitment to living collaboratively, caringly, and sanely with other beings, all other beings who inhabit this earth. We might think of the confinement as a chrysalis, which we entered as caterpillars, but might we emerge from this confinement having grown wings? That, at least, is perhaps one maybe overly optimistic, but I think hopeful way of treating this period that we are all involved in, this time of confinement, in a way that can be genuinely transformative. And I do feel that for many of us, this coronavirus pandemic has really given a major shock to our collective system as human beings living on this earth. And rather than just go back to how things were before, might we be able to use this experience as a turning point, as a moment in which we're able to turn around, not just in our own inner experience, in our own solitude, but find how this solitude is also a foundation for living differently in the world. The solitude is not left behind when you leave the retreat center or your lockdown. Solitude, true solitude, is something that we can bring with us wherever we go, wherever we are. We have that capacity to maintain and cultivate that inner clarity and inner stability, which is so much at the heart of what Gautama taught us. So what I'd like to do now is to offer a short period of meditation. And what I would like to do is focus precisely on what I've been talking about and ask you, all of you, to meditate on nirvana, this inner solitude. And so we'll only do this for 10 minutes. It'll be a a brief reflection, but maybe if you find it interesting, you can develop it further in your own time. And then we'll conclude this session with a period of questions and answers. And as Daniel already explained, you can write those into the Q&A folder, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But now for the meditation. So try to find a posture in which your back is comfortably upright, not supported by the back of the chair, but just sitting with your buttocks on the chair or a cushion or whatever you're sitting on, and just feeling your back upright, your shoulders relaxed, your eyes maybe half closed. Bring your attention to some object that is helpful for you in just settling down. For some of us, that's the breath. For others, it'll be something else. Doesn't really matter. So just for a few moments, let's just collect ourselves and come to a stiller space within us. So as you become more still, first of all, just allow yourself to say yes. This is the situation in which I find myself in this moment. If there's something unpleasant, I say yes to that. If there's something pleasant going on, I say yes to that as well. Try to embrace the totality of what's happening to you right now, without judgment, without criticism, without reserve. What's going on in your mind, in your body, maybe sounds that are filtering in through your ears. And noticing in particular if there are thoughts bubbling up or feelings locked into your body somewhere. Especially those thoughts and feelings that are reactive. Whether it's a niggling little voice that won't be quiet, or whether it's a dull ache of emotion somewhere in your stomach that won't go away. And open your mind to just say yes to that as well. To accept that that's part and parcel of life as it manifests for you right now. And do you notice a part of yourself that's not being reactive? I would suggest that simply in the act of being aware or mindful of what's going on, you are already in a non-reactive space. You can be mindful of these worries, these anxieties, this dark feeling in your stomach, but the awareness or mindfulness is not caught up in those reactions that you are now noticing, you're now aware of, and registering. Try and let your attention settle on that non-reactive attention itself. This might be easier if you're feeling calm and peaceful. But nirvana is not just something that we experience when everything is great or fine. It's also the capacity to be non-reactively aware, even in the midst of turmoil and stress. This is where meditation really comes into its own. And what Gautama encouraged was to behold or see this non-reactive attention, this non-reactive space, and to let ourselves dwell, come to rest in that, not just as an idea, but as an embodied experience. So for the remainder of this sitting, I'd invite you to just rest and dwell in whatever within you is not reactive. See if you can somehow feel it and even taste the flavor of that perspective. And just rest there, just stay there. If you get distracted, gently come back and start afresh. Okay. If I had a bell to hand, which I don't, I would ring it at this point. And now is the time we're going to have for a bit of discussion, and I will invite Danya to facilitate that. Danya.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I will start with a question from Randall, who asks, when is belief valuable?
Well, that's probably Randall in California, who I owe a letter to about Socrates, I suspect. Maybe not. If it is, hi Randall, the email is on its way. Well, I think you have to distinguish between, when talking about belief, I think you have to distinguish between belief with a big B and belief with a small b. And belief with a small b is indispensable for living, essentially. In other words, if we didn't have a whole raft of things that we kind of assume to be true and believe in, and people we trust and believe in, and so on, we wouldn't be able to survive. But I suspect Randall's question has to do not with that sort of belief, but with belief with a big B. And this might be whether you believe in God, or whether you believe in reincarnation, or whether you believe that emptiness is the nature of ultimate reality. And I'm not convinced that any of these big B beliefs are terribly useful. On the other hand, I have to qualify that by saying not particularly useful in my own case. I've had periods of my Buddhist practice where I found holding on to some of those beliefs was quite valuable. It gave me a sense of orientation. It gave me a sense of something to trust in. It secured my relationship with those people who were teaching me. And I think they certainly served a purpose. And I think for others, particularly those who don't have some of the privileges that we, white, middle class, relatively prosperous people have, those kind of beliefs can serve as an enormous consolation in what is otherwise a very difficult and painful existence. Believing in God can give great hope. Believing in reincarnation, likewise, can be a lifesaver for some people. So I don't want to generalize that broadly. I personally believe that what Gautama the Buddha was teaching was very critical of the need for human beings to hold on to beliefs with a big B, or what we might call metaphysical beliefs. And I think that he really sought to wean us away from those things, but to do so, he also recognized that we needed to have a place to live, and we needed to have enough to eat, and that we needed to have enough to wear, we needed to have basic medical care. These were the four things that he often mentioned. And it's on that basis that we can then begin to have a kind of life in which we're less and less beholden to these sorts of beliefs, which in general are things we can neither prove nor disprove, and to become more autonomous in the way that we think, and to slowly begin to leave these metaphysical consolations and these big ideas behind, and instead to have the courage and the resources within ourselves that we've cultivated perhaps in our solitude, to be able to engage with the life that we find ourselves in, personally, communally, socially, politically, economically, and engage with those issues, to engage with the so-called real world, rather than to feel that there is some kind of hidden reality, a greater reality, for which this life is just a sort of a staging post. So I could go on, but I won't. Next question, Danya.
Yeah, so we have a question from Eric. How do we square this notion of nirvana with its etymology along the lines of blowing out a candle or with cessation experiences?
I think we can use those metaphors, but the blowing out of the candle is again a rather final metaphor. And I'm not actually sure we find that in the sutras, I'm not sure. We might somewhere. But again, this is the baggage that the word nirvana carries. It carries the baggage of extinction, in the sense that once we've attained some kind of deep insight into reality, that will lead to all of these mental habits and these emotions and these desires and these fears and so on will be miraculously blown out and like extinguished like a lamp. We experience then cessation, and a cessation that supposedly is permanent, that won't go away. It will be forever after. And Buddhism is very famous for declaring the ending of suffering, as though that is an attainable goal. Now, of course, what I've been saying, and again, what Buddhadasa is saying, I'm very glad to have Buddhadasa on my side here. There are other ways of looking at this. And it strikes me that there's plenty of material in the canon, as well as in many, many Buddhist teachings, that valorize not this cessation of particularly suffering, but the momentary stopping, the momentary ceasing of habits of mind, of emotions and desires and fears. I find that's a much more pragmatic way of handling this concept of nirvana. That when a particular emotion dies down and comes to a stop, that is the ceasing of greed, the ending of attachment. And remember that when the Buddha spoke of the ending of suffering in the first discourse, when he explains what he means, he actually says the ending of suffering is the ending of reactivity, which is, of course, nirvana. My own sense is that what counts is the stopping of these reactive habits and patterns. And this stopping we can see in two ways, as I mentioned. On the one hand, the literal momentary stopping of these powerful and often destructive emotions. But perhaps more importantly, acknowledging that as soon as we are conscious and aware and mindful of these reactive emotions, we've already touched a moment of stopping within mindfulness itself. That mindfulness is non-reactive, mindfulness is nirvanic already. And I think this makes sense of the opening claim we find in the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, where the Buddha says that mindfulness is the only way, or the direct way, people prefer, to nirvana. This is the statement he makes. Nirvana is the direct way to nirvana. Sorry, mindfulness is the direct way to nirvana. And I think what that means is that being mindful means you are already nirvanic. Another curious thing is that when the Buddha spoke of embracing dukkha, embracing life, the word he uses for embrace, parinya, is defined, again by the Buddha himself, as the ending of greed, of hatred, and delusion. So embracing life in a non-reactive way is already a nirvanic moment. The problem is we've put nirvana just so way out of reach, so inaccessible to ordinary mortals like you and me, that it becomes somehow unattainable, or only attainable under highly special conditions for very special people. And this is the point that secular Dharma, backed up by people like Buddhadasa, are trying to reclaim, that nirvana is now. Each time you are aware, each time there is a momentary cessation, that experience is nirvanic. Next question. We've got 41 on the list. We're not going to get through all of these. I'll try and be a little bit more economic in my use of words.
So maybe this can even continue the thread you were just on, but Paul asks, do you have advice about bringing that sense of nirvana that you have referred to into the midst of the busy moments of everyday life?
I don't have any advice more than what pretty much every Buddhist teacher will tell you, and that is you have to keep practicing. It's not going to happen by itself. And unfortunately, it requires a lot of work and a lot of self-examination and a lot of being honest with yourself. And also constantly being aware of how we fail. You know, we have our daily meditation, we feel really great. We think we're going to radiate compassion all day. And what happens? Sometimes the total opposite. So the key here really is a heartfelt dedication to whatever practice we may be doing, to make it part and parcel of who we feel ourselves to be, rather than an exercise that we perform at certain times of the day or go on retreats once or twice a year. That really has to be what it's about. In other words, to somehow internalize and embody these values and these teachings so that they become our own. Again, we find an expression in the early suttas again and again that this practice is about becoming independent of others. It's about becoming autonomous. It's about becoming your own authority. And that is something too that we need very much to work on. And so that, I'm afraid, is all I can say. And that's not terribly original. But I really have no magic tricks that I can share with you that will make it any easier.
Barry asks, can solitude and or meditation become a vehicle for avoidance?
Oh yeah, easy. It happens all the time. It's, yeah, anything can become, virtually anything, I would say, can become a way of avoiding something else. And yeah, it's certainly, there are probably all too many people, unfortunately, who spend, you know, hours and hours, years and years sitting on cushions for all kinds of reasons. Some of them not particularly worthy, simply because they can't cope with, you know, the challenges of the world or whatever. And I think a lot of monasteries, I've lived in monasteries, have their fair share of people who are there because they just can't, they don't really work, they don't really function very well in the wide world. The trouble is, when they get to the monastery, they find that the monastery is the wide world in microcosm, very often, just a smaller version of the same thing. So yes, and I don't think we can ever we can never be complacent about this. I think you can have deep spiritual experiences, you can be a thoroughly sort of good practitioner, and then you get it really wrong. Then you find that actually this is all about avoiding something else. And so there's no end to it. I don't believe in human perfection, but I do believe in the capacity we have to become less and less imperfect. Next one.
So Ignacio asks, I agree that for some spiritual practices, a certain level of privilege might be necessary. So how can we, the people who possess such privilege, help people during this time that do not possess this privilege? How can we help them in a way that they may also experience the butterfly metaphor?
Well, this really very much depends upon your own capacities, your own situations in life, your own abilities, your own skills. So it's very difficult to just give a kind of a generic answer to that question. I think the first point is in solitude, like we're experiencing now, to quieten down through meditation or through art, or whatever we do, such that we become more sensitized to the suffering of others. And there may be people in our immediate environment who are in pain, but certainly we only have to switch on the TV, listen to the news, and we become aware of the enormity of suffering that's being experienced by people in the world today, economic hardship, all kinds of things. And that then is a call for us to ask, how can I respond to that? And I think the lockdown gives us the time and the space to really dwell on that question. Not to think, oh yeah, I think I'll go and help out in a hospice. And then we forget about it. but really to tap down deep into yourself and ask, how can I help? In my own case, as a writer, I write about this. I try to communicate values and skills that I found helpful in addressing this, this current situation. I've written quite a long essay called Embracing Extinction that will be published in the next issue of Tricycle. And that's been my way of trying to use my skills and resources to address this crisis that we face. But each of you has to find a way that is suited to your particular situation, your skills, and your resources. Next.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Could you explain the difference between skillful doubt and unskillful doubt? Is this the same as small b or big B believing, or somehow different?
I would say somehow, well, let's see. I mean, I use the word doubt, both in a very positive sense, and also I recognize that it can be used in a very negative sense. Early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, when they use the word doubt, they see it as a hindrance or an obstacle. And I'm not sure if doubt is the right translation. Now, I would actually prefer something like vacillation. So to me, a small d doubt would be a chronic vacillation. In other words, the mind just switches back and forth. Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? Should I do that? Can't decide, can't make up my mind. There's a wonderful Tibetan metaphor for the small d doubt, and that is that it says that this kind of doubt is like trying to sew a piece of cloth with a double head, with a two-pointed needle. It captures very well the fact that this kind of doubt is basically a state of being stuck. Try and imagine sewing with a two-pointed needle. It just rams into the cloth and nothing happens. And I think that's what distinguishes the small doubt from the big doubt. The big doubt, or what they call in Zen sometimes, the great doubt. The great doubt is the capacity we have to hold the whole of our experience in uncertainty. And that means to be able to ask a question like, what is this? What is this? A koan. What is this? And to be able to stay with that question, that's the practice of the great doubt. And that's not something that leaves us stuck. It leaves us into a state in which we are, in a way, forced to break through our limitations and our hesitations and reach some higher state of understanding. There's a famous koan that goes, if you say this is a table, I'll give you 30 blows. If you say this is not a table, I'll give you 30 blows. What is it? That's the great doubt. Stay with the question. Stay with the question and see where it takes you in that kind of existential state of uncertainty. Thank you. I think we actually are coming to the conclusion now of our time together. And I'm just going to say just one or two words before I pass back to Danya and she will wrap the session up. If you've been interested in any of these ideas, they're explored at far greater length in many of my books. There's also a lot of my talks available on Dharma Seed, through Bodily College and elsewhere. And again, I hope that what I've shared with you might likewise lead you to further your interests and develop your practices in whatever ways bring you some kind of flourishing in your life. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate that this is a a session that I am offering as a benefit to Gaia House, the meditation center that I've been involved in for many years in England, currently closed. We don't know when we're going to be open again. And if you would like to offer any dana that you may have been inspired to do by listening to this talk, or simply because you may know Gaia House and people have worked and practiced there in the past, then there's a link on the chat section, and we'd be most grateful to receive for whatever you're able to offer. So thank you very much. That's Gaia House, G-A-I-A House, if you can't find the link. Thank you. Danya.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for sharing this call with us today. It was very helpful. And thank you to everyone for joining us. If you'd like to continue studying with Stephen, I will also mention one other opportunity, which is an online course called Secular Dharma that he and Martine Batchelor offer through Tricycle online courses. So you can also find out more about that at learn.tricycle.org. We are continuing these practice sessions. We have another one this Thursday at 3 p.m. US Eastern Time with Pilar Jennings. And you can check tricycle.org/live for all of the upcoming session dates, as well as the recordings of this session and past sessions. We're really grateful to everyone for being here, for asking your fantastic questions, and so grateful to you, Stephen. So thank you, everyone, and please be healthy and safe in this time.
And thank you, Danya, for facilitating this. You did a great job. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Keep well. See you later, maybe. Who knows? Strange world. Bye-bye.